My name is Madison. I'm 29 years old, and nothing could have prepared me for the day my own mother inherited $36 million and kicked me out like I was trash. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're useless to me now." But what she did not know about the will would change everything in just 24 hours. Before I reveal how everything flipped, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and hit like and subscribe for more family betrayals that prove money changes everything. I was 7 when the world cracked. One minute I was at the kitchen table, coloring a crooked rainbow on the back of a grocery list, and the next minute my father, David, slid down the wall by the coffee maker, his mug shattering, his face going slack. I remember the hiss of the kettle, the way the steam clouded his glasses, and my mother's voice flat, efficient, dialing 911 like she was ordering a taxi. The paramedics moved quickly, straps and questions, the smell of rubbing alcohol and winter air. I held the torn grocery list in my fist until the paper went soft with sweat. At the hospital, the hallways hummed. A nurse pressed a paper cup of water into my hand, but my fingers were trembling too hard to drink. I learned the word stroke that night, learned what it looks like when a face you love stops recognizing you. The machines blinked and beeped, and I kept waiting for my dad to sit up and tell a bad joke. He had a drawer in the garage labeled mystery screws, and I thought if I could just bring him one, he'd laugh and everything would snap back into place. It didn't. He was gone before midnight. People say grief is loud, but my mother's grief was silent and surgical. She hardly cried. She checked her lipstick in a pocket mirror and asked which office handled the life insurance policy. She wanted dates, numbers, account names. "Do you have the will on file?" she asked the hospital social worker the next morning, as if a signature could warm the sheets he had just left. When the funeral director asked about floral arrangements, she cut him off to ask whether the death certificate could be expedited. I watched her write bullet points in a leather notebook with a gold pen: policy, beneficiaries, probate, contact Collins. She spelled everything correctly. I remember the funeral mostly as a blur of perfume, coffee urns, and murmured opinions about casket wood. My mother stood in a black dress that still had a price tag hidden under the zipper. She accepted hugs with both hands, a politician at a fundraiser. When someone mentioned my father's laugh, she smiled politely and changed the subject to paperwork, whispering about timelines, penalties, and what David would have wanted, though the last phrase sounded like a line she'd rehearsed, not something she felt. After the guests drifted away, the house felt too bright, every lamp on, the dishwasher humming like a heartbeat we couldn't hear anymore. My mother took the phone into her bedroom and closed the door. I could hear her through the wood. "Yes, I need to understand the payout schedule. And the premiums we already paid, are those refundable?" I sat on the hallway carpet and pressed my palm flat to the seam where the door met the floor, the way you might check for fire. It was cold. The turning point came the next morning before school when an old red pickup truck rattled into our driveway. It was my grandfather, Frank Ramirez, my father's father-in-law, my mother's father, wearing the same battered hat he'd worn in every photograph I'd ever seen. He had been a farmer once, down in Texas, before he built a chain of building supply stores from nothing but calluses and stubbornness. I knew those lines from family stories, told like folklore at holidays. The first store with a leaky roof, the second with a register that jammed, the day the third finally turned a profit. When he knelt to hug me, his hands were rough and warm, like a fence post in July. "Hey, honey," he said softly. It was only 2 words, but they filled up the room, the opposite of my mother's echoing calls. He didn't ask about insurance. He didn't ask about probate. He asked if I'd eaten. He cooked eggs in our kitchen like he owned the stove, using too much butter and humming along to an old AM station. He poured my cereal into a real bowl instead of a paper cup grabbed at the door. He added a slice of orange on the side and said, "For the color." When my mother came in, heels clicking, he nodded respectfully. She glanced at her watch. "Frank, I have a meeting with an attorney at 10, she said. "We have to be practical." He tilted his head like he was listening for rain. "Practical is a child who's fed and walked to class," he replied. It was the first time I saw my mother blink without speaking. He drove me to school in that red pickup, the passenger seat duct-taped along one seam, the heater squeaking like a tired mouse. He turned the radio down at the crosswalk and said, almost to himself, "We're going to take care of you." After school, he was waiting at the curb with a paper sack from a bakery. Inside were 2 conchas and a note on the back of a receipt for after homework. We sat at the tiny kitchen table and he asked me to show him my spelling words. He made me gravy on toast for dinner and told me about lumber, how to tell a straight plank by rolling it on the floor and listening for the wobble. "It's like people," he said. "You learn to hear what's true." At night, my mother's calls continued: lawyers, insurance agents, a notary who could come on short notice. She spoke in a tone that made the conversations sound like investments. I began to understand that we were living in 2 different houses at once, hers, made of deadlines and figures, and Frank's, made of meals, rides, and a hand steadying my backpack straps before I left for school. He didn't argue with her. He simply began to occupy all the spaces she didn't. Within a week, he had moved a few of his things into the guest room: 1 pair of boots, a stack of flannel shirts, a shaving kit that smelled like pine. He fixed the loose hinge on the bathroom cabinet without announcing it. He taped my dad's photo from the garage inside a kitchen cabinet where we could see it every morning when we reached for bowls. At school, I stopped crying in the cafeteria. I knew who would be outside the doors at 3 o'clock, hands in his coat pockets, watching the pigeons jump. When he drove, he told stories about the first store he opened, how the roof leaked so bad he set out buckets and patched the worst of it with tar he heated on a hot plate. "You start where you are," he said. "You start with what you've got." He said it like a prayer, not a slogan. My mother began working later, scheduling essential meetings after dinner. She left sticky notes on the fridge with reminders about documents she needed me to sign for school. Frank wrote under them, "Breakfast at 7:15. Punctuality is a kindness." He put out my clothes at night, not because I couldn't do it, but because he understood that mornings had become a maze. When I woke up shaking from dreams where my father couldn't speak, Frank sat on the edge of my bed and counted my breaths with me, putting one hand on my shoulder. My grandfather taught me what money couldn't buy. He was a modest man who measured a day by the work he put into it, not by what he could show off. He fixed things other people threw away: lamps, lawn mowers, a neighbor's wobbly chair, and he never sent an invoice. "Pay me in peach cobbler," he'd say, and mean it. His hands were stained with oil and cedar dust, and he carried the smell of both into every room like a quiet introduction. He kept nails and coffee cans and bolts sorted into mason jars with masking tape labels in his careful block letters. He sharpened his own pencils with a pocket knife, ran his thumb along the point, and put them back in his shirt pocket like prize tools. If a job took 10 steps, he did 12, just in case. He checked the level twice and measured 3 times, squinting one eye and smiling sideways when the bubble floated dead center. "Wealth is not what you have in the bank, but what you have inside," he told me, tapping 2 fingers lightly against my sternum. "Character is a savings account nobody can drain." At the stores he built, he knew employees' birthdays without looking at a calendar. He kept a stash of gift cards in the safe for emergencies and a stack of application forms under the counter for men who came in looking for a chance more than a wage. When a storm knocked out power across half the city, he opened the warehouse with flashlights and sold generators at cost. "We'll make it back in trust," he told a manager who worried about margins. And he meant it. People returned because they believed him. At dinner, he bowed his head for a beat longer than anyone else and then ate simply beans, rice, a piece of chicken like a man who had known hunger and never forgot its lesson. He kept his wedding band on a chain around his neck because his fingers swelled when he worked, and he said that way it rested near his heart. My mother, Carol, couldn't stand any of it. She was his daughter and the complete opposite, a woman who believed life was a runway and every moment a photo opportunity. She didn't see a pickup, she saw a problem. "You own stores," she'd say, staring at the truck like it was contagious. "Image matters." She collected brand names the way Frank collected spare parts, handbags perched on their dust bags in perfect rows, shoes sleeping in boxes with tissue paper folded like hospital corners. When she raised a glass, it was always to connections. She called friendships investments and introduced people by the names of their employers, as if a person's business card were their birth certificate. Where Frank's calendar marked deliveries and community fundraisers, Carol's was a lattice of charity galas and launch parties. She treated lunches like chess moves and kept score by headlines and table placements. At home, she bookmarked real estate listings that glittered with phrases like gated and exclusive, and she tried to convince Frank to trade his faded cap for a logoed one that matched a sponsorship package. He would smile, tuck the cap lower, and step into his boots. "My head doesn't know the difference," he'd say. The day a salesman tried to upsell him on a new truck with leather seats and a dashboard that looked like a spaceship, Carol lit up like a showroom bulb. Frank listened to the pitch with his hands in his pockets and then asked the only question that mattered to him. Will it haul a full pallet of cement without whining? When the salesman hesitated, he patted the hood of his old truck and said, "So, she's loud, but practical." Carol sighed loudly enough for 3 people. On Saturdays, Frank would visit each store, moving through the aisles with the unhurried stride of a man who trusts his own pace. He straightened price tags, asked after a cashier's mother's surgery, and showed a teenager how to find the stud behind drywall by listening for a change in the knock. He taught me to hear it too, how the wall sounded hollower between the bones. "That's life," he said. "Find the studs and build on those." When customers tried to slip extra cash into his hand after he helped load their lumber, he folded their fingers back around the bills. "Spend that on supper," he'd murmur. My mother's world ran on a different map. She told me not to wear off-brand sneakers to a networking brunch because details signal value. She hated waiting lines, slow websites, small talk that didn't end in a deal. Frank could stand at a counter for 20 minutes talking about the difference between galvanized and stainless and come away having made a friend. He never scolded her outright. He just practiced what he believed, with a gentleness that made it hard to argue. When a supplier delivered a shipment short by 3 boxes and offered a discount to make up for it, Frank said, "Bring me the boxes. I'll pay full when you do." Carol rolled her eyes. "Dad, you're leaving money on the table." He smiled. "I'm setting a table other people can eat at." Sometimes, to prove a point, she tried to upgrade him. She bought him a designer watch he never set and wound, a cologne he wore once and then kept in the back of the medicine cabinet because the smell made him sneeze. She framed a glossy photo of him shaking hands with a city councilman and put it on the mantel. He replaced it with a Polaroid of a boy he'd sponsored for baseball, cleats muddy, grin wide enough to split the picture. He hit a double, he told me, tapping the edge of the frame like it might slide away if he didn't keep it honest. I learned, watching them, that you can be related to someone and still speak different currencies. I chose marketing because it felt like a bridge to my mother's world. While my friends chased psychology or finance, I pictured myself sliding into Carol's orbit with clean decks and clever taglines, finally speaking a language she respected: metrics, reach, ROI. I toured campuses with her in sleek blazers she picked, nodding as she asked admissions reps about internship pipelines and brand adjacency. I heard myself echo her words and hoped that, if I sounded like her, she might hear me. Freshman year, I learned segmentation before statistics, how to read a room before I could read a balance sheet. I took notes like I was collecting proof that I could be useful: consumer journeys, A/B testing, heat maps of attention. At night, I mocked up campaigns on my dorm laptop and emailed drafts titled "For Mom Ideas." She answered once, "Looks clean. Try a bolder font." I wore that sentence like a locket for 2 weeks. By sophomore year, I lived on coffee and Google Slides. I interned at a boutique agency that built launch parties for brands my mother worshipped. I sprayed sample perfume cards until my fingertips smelled expensive, stuck branded decals on mirrored photo walls, and watched women with wrist stacks and perfect hair tag the sponsor without smudging their lipstick. I imagined introducing Carol to the creative director and becoming her +1 in the only way that mattered. When I finally invited her to a client mixer, my name on the tiny line that said staff, she arrived 30 minutes late, left 40 minutes early, and told me in the car, "You should network with people who can move you up, Madison." Not just these event girls. Junior year, I pitched her directly. I built a deck for one of her charity committees, clean typography, a color story that matched the gala's peony pink invitations, a donor journey that made giving feel like belonging. I rehearsed in the mirror until my mouth knew when to smile. She barely glanced at the slides. "Send it to Monica," she said, already texting. Monica wrote back 2 days later, "We already have a direction. Thanks." When the gala photos hit social, the color palette was mine, the caption copy almost word for word, and my name nowhere. I kept trying. I redid her personal website one weekend, tightening the bio, swapping grainy photos for the ones I'd taken on my cracked phone, adding a press page that made her look inevitable. I sent the link with a little spark emoji I immediately regretted. She replied, "We'll have my PR team review." The site stayed exactly as it had been, slow, outdated, still featuring an event from 3 years ago with a misspelled sponsor. On Sundays, the ache of disappointment softened in the warm rectangle of my grandfather's kitchen. Frank set the cast-iron skillet on the stove. We sifted cornmeal with flour and salt, whisked in buttermilk and melted butter until the batter ran like yellow velvet. He'd flick a few drops into the pan to test the heat. If they danced, we poured. The oven door squeaked. The radio murmured a station that still played Elvis between farm reports and weather. "Hear that?" he'd say when a guitar line slid in. "It's simple, but it stays." He meant both the song and the recipe. We ate cornbread hot, slices split and buttered until the edges glistened. Frank talked politics the way he talked boards and beams, where the pressure points were, what would hold, what was just talk. He didn't shout. He compared policies to fences. Good ones keep the calves safe without cutting the field in half. He let me disagree and made me defend my point, nodding when I did it without heat. Between classes and shifts, I kept collecting reasons for my mother to claim me. I volunteered to run the student market's social account and doubled foot traffic with a series called What's in Your Backpack. I built a tiny database for a local food pantry and taught the director to read the dashboard. I brought the reports to Carol like trophies. She skimmed for logos, not numbers. "Cute," she said of the pantry. But who was there? Senior year came with a capstone project and the hope that this would be the one. My team chose a regional chain that sold building materials, close enough to Frank's world to feel like a blessing, close enough to my mother's aesthetic standards to be impressive. We conducted store intercepts, counted trucks in the parking lot by hour, mapped competitor pricing, and filmed testimonials in dusty aisles. I invited both of them to the final presentation, the man who taught me to listen for studs, and the woman I was still trying to build a bridge to. Frank arrived 15 minutes early in a clean shirt and his good hat, seating himself in the front row like he was about to watch the best show in town. He shook my professor's hand, complimented the classroom's chalkboard, holds up better than whiteboard, and turned his phone off with ceremony. Carol texted at the start time, "Running late." "Don't wait." She didn't come. Frank took notes on an index card while I spoke, writing down phrases I watched him underline. Trust, word of mouth, honest pricing. Afterward, he stood to clap as if the room were bigger. "You spoke plain, honey," he said. "That's how people hear you." Graduation landed like a deadline. I crossed the stage and felt nothing until I saw Frank in the stands, 2 fingers in his mouth, whistling like he did for yearling calves. Carol found me by the photo backdrop where everyone held branded frames. She adjusted my cap, kissed the air near my cheek, and pressed a slim box into my hand. Inside was a card holder embossed with a luxury logo. "Carry your business cards in something that says who you are," she said. But I wanted to tell her it already didn't. That afternoon, I laid my diploma on her marble kitchen island like a treaty. "I want to help you," I told her. "Your committees, the fundraisers, the partnerships. I can bring structure." She sipped iced coffee, glanced at the gold-foiled parchment, and said, "We'll see. These things are about relationships." Then, as if to prove it, she swept me into a trunk show where she introduced me 3 times as my daughter Madison. She's in marketing. Always the pause, the ellipsis, as if even my major needed tailoring. She kept setting my work next to her handbags like it was another accessory. Useful, maybe, but not the point. So I kept baking on Sundays and reading the paper with Frank spread out like a map, headlines, local editorials, box scores. We folded it and slid crumbs off the table with our palms. I told him about click-through rates and customer lifetime value. He told me about a board that looked straight but bowed over time. You keep checking the line, he said. That's the work. When the cardiologist said another event, I heard it as a siren. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and moved back to Frank's house in Dallas. The old pickup still sat in the driveway, stubborn and reliable, like the man himself. Inside, I made a sick room out of the master bedroom. Fresh sheets tucked tight, a pill organizer labeled by day and color, the blood pressure cuff in the nightstand drawer, a notebook on the dresser where I logged every dose and every breath that seemed too shallow. Mornings were a choreography, nitro within reach, low-sodium breakfast, the first round of pills with applesauce, because swallowing hurt after the stent. I stuck the hospital discharge instructions to the fridge with duct tape. The list was both comfort and threat. Avoid exertion, watch for chest pain, call 911 if. I learned each nurse's name on the cardiology floor, kept their numbers, and saved the sound of Frank's calmer breaths for later when the house got too quiet. Then my mother began appearing with expensive wine and warm smiles, as if warmth could be bought by the bottle. Every Thursday, like a standing appointment, a rideshare slid up to the curb and Carol stepped out holding a branded tote and a bouquet that smelled like a department store. Brought something nice, she'd say, cradling a bottle with a label in cursive script, a country no one we knew had ever visited. Frank couldn't drink with his meds, but she set the bottle on the counter like a trophy and asked for a good corkscrew. Her visits had the shine of hospitality and the weight of an audit. She'd sit at the edge of his bed, patting his hand lightly, and then steer the talk toward paperwork. Dad, have you thought about arrangements? She rolled that word around like it was a gemstone, not a hammer. Mr. Collins is very capable, but he needs clarity. Wills, beneficiary updates, you know how these things can get messy. I watched Frank's eyes. He always redirected. How's your week, Carol? He'd ask. Sold any more of those profitable relationships? He'd say it gently, the way a farmer jokes about rain. She came bearing items with names, Premier Reserve, Grand Selection, Limited Edition, labels that matched her tone when she talked about donors and galas. She smiled with all her teeth and inspected the house with quick, appraising glances, the way realtors learn a property, the art over the couch, framed handbill for a county fair, the old pecan table, scuffed, original. The photo of me and Frank eating cornbread out of the skillet, unframed magnet. She mentioned markets and valuations as if the walls had ears that might bid. Meanwhile, the days stretched like taffy. Cardiac rehab on Tuesdays, weighed carefully against the Texas heat. Short walks to the mailbox, holding his elbow like a fragile hinge. We swapped bacon for oatmeal, salted with stories. I learned to read his face for pain before he admitted it. In the afternoons, I wheeled the oxygen tank to the porch, and we listened to Elvis on the old radio because Frank said the beat steadied his heart. He would tap a rhythm on the armrest and close his eyes, the lines in his forehead smoothing, and I would breathe with him. The first night back from a scare, sirens, ER bracelets, me whispering, "Stay with me," Carol arrived in a white dress and heels that clicked on the hospital tile. She put a glossy magazine on the tray, open to a page with a philanthropy spotlight featuring her name. "Just a small piece," she said, angling it toward Frank's eyes. He looked at the ceiling. She took a selfie with the heart monitor peeking in the corner, then caught herself and flipped the camera. "You have to keep spirits up," she told me. "Positive thinking is essential." She meant the article. At home, I installed grab bars in the shower, patted the bed rails with rolled towels, and set a chair by the stove because standing made Frank dizzy. I learned the trick of cornbread without salt, more buttermilk, a whisper of honey, butter brushed across the top right out of the oven so the edges tasted like memory. He ate small squares, proud of my adjustments. On Sundays, whether he felt strong or not, we still mixed batter to the hum of the radio. "Don't let pain erase traditions," he murmured, as if he were the one taking care of me. Every Thursday, Carol's tote delivered more glitter, macarons in a pastel box, an orchid that needed misting, a brochure for a legacy planning seminar at a hotel where valet cost more than our monthly electricity. She asked casual questions that weren't casual. Who has the deed, technically? Is the business structured under the trust yet? It's safer if I help shoulder some of the oversight. She said oversight like a gift. Once, when Frank dozed, she leaned against the kitchen island and lowered her voice. Madison, taking care of him is admirable, but you should be realistic. He hates being a burden. If he could put things in order now, he would. Timing is everything. She smiled again, the soft kind that never reached her eyes. Mr. Collins will confirm. I rinsed the coffee pot until it squeaked, pretending not to hear the part where her certainty assumed she would be the one inheriting order. Some nights, exhaustion pressed me flat. I slept on the couch with the baby monitor hissing, the oxygen machine purring like a tired cat. I kept a go bag by the door, chargers, insurance cards, a clean t-shirt, toothpaste, quarters for the vending machine coffee I hated but needed at 3 a.m. Carol would text after midnight. Any updates? The next morning she'd arrive with a bottle and a plan, cooing, "How's my favorite patient?" She stayed an hour, too, if someone important canceled. She left with a kiss on the air and a reminder, we mustn't procrastinate on the legal side. Frank never complained about her. After she left, he'd watch the driveway until the taillights disappeared and then ask me to put the radio back on. He called me kiddo again, the way he did when I was small. We've got enough, he'd say, tapping his chest. Inside, not outside. I sat on the edge of the bed with a notebook and wrote down his oxygen level, his pain score, his words. The numbers I reported to nurses, the words I kept for the days when the house would be too quiet, and every bottle on the counter would be just glass with a label that meant nothing at all. Frank started calling it weatherproofing, the way a farmer names everything about survival after too many seasons of hail. He said the word when we copied medical records into a folder marked with a black star, when I learned how to change the filter on the oxygen concentrator. People show their true colors when they think no one is watching, he'd say, easing himself into the kitchen chair with both hands on the table. He had me print bank statements and stack them in chronological order, paper-clipped by month. We won't need most of it, he promised, but it helps to know the shape of your own life. He taped a small envelope to the inside of the pantry door, ICE for Mr. Collins. The flap was sealed with the kind of carefulness he reserved for gift wrap and bandages. The first time he asked me to drive him to Collins's office, I thought it was about insurance forms. The building was an old brick box with a shade tree that rained pollen onto the sidewalk and left gold dust on the windshield. Inside smelled faintly of leather and copier toner. Mr. Collins was tall and mild, the kind of man whose tie knots always looked right. He shook my hand like he was measuring trust. Good to see you, Madison, he said, like we'd met before. Frank speaks of you. My grandfather settled into the client chair and said, we're just doing our weatherproofing. They talked in plain sentences that still somehow kept their middle hidden. Words like succession, documents, contingencies. Collins slid papers across the desk and slid them back when Frank shook his head. No rush, Collins said, and Frank chuckled. That's a dangerous thing to say to a man who keeps time by harvests. I sat quietly, taking in the rhythm, feeling like I'd been allowed into a room I didn't yet have a key for. When we stood to leave, Collins looked at me and said, if he asks you to trust him, do it. It felt rehearsed, and that made me nervous. At home, Frank folded receipts at the table like tiny tents and wrote dates on the peaks. He labeled boxes in the hall closet with his block letters, winter, tools, taxes, stories. Why stories? I asked, balanced on a stool so I could reach the top shelf. He smiled. Because not everything valuable fits in numbers. Inside that box were photographs, the belt he'd repaired twice, a postcard from a supplier signed with a joke only they would understand, and a recipe card in my abuela's handwriting stained with oil. He set the lid on it like a benediction. He made small changes I almost didn't notice, moving the spare key to a different jar, replacing the worn-out padlock on the backyard shed, writing phone numbers in ink instead of pencil. He cleaned the glove compartment and folded a map, even though we rarely left the neighborhood. Every time Carol left after one of her polished visits, he would lean back and close his eyes like he was listening for a faraway train. "That girl is good at pretending she's not auditioning," he murmured once, not unkindly. I wanted to defend her, but he raised a palm. "Let people be what they practice," he said. "And don't confuse a stage with a home." Then, as if to soften it, he tapped the radio. Elvis drifted in, a soft, familiar slide of voice. We washed dishes and let the song finish before speaking again. The second time we visited Collins, I noticed my name on more pages. Not signatures, just references. "Is this for me?" I whispered. Eventually, Frank answered. "Not yet." He squeezed my fingers once. Some things you don't open until the storm actually hits. Collins's secretary brought out a tin of butter cookies and whispered that she always saved the pretzel-shaped ones for Frank. He laughed and told me that patience tastes like sugar when someone else bakes it for you. He asked me 3 separate times to promise I would trust him. The first was on the porch with the oxygen tubing looped like a pale lasso at his feet. "Kiddo, if it looks sideways later, wait a day before you panic," he said. "Trust me." The second was in the driveway after a physical therapy appointment, when the sun made him squint and he had to sit in the truck longer than usual. "If words start flying, don't grab the first one that lands," he said. "Trust me." The third was at the kitchen sink while we dried the cast iron, and he made me look him in the eyes. "If I am not here to explain," he said, "explanations are already in place. Trust me." I nodded each time, but the promise felt like a tool I hadn't learned to use. Sometimes I grew impatient with the secrecy. "Just tell me, Frank," I said once, sharper than I meant to. "Tell me what you're doing." He shook his head. "If I tell you the end of the story, you'll stop listening to the parts that teach you how to live." He said it kindly, but it stung. Later he brought me a slice of cornbread and a glass of milk and apologized for making me feel left out. "I'm not hiding it from you," he said. "I'm hiding it for you. There's a difference." And still, I didn't understand. I only understood the way his hand felt steadier in mine when we walked, the way Mr. Collins's voice softened when he spoke to me, the way the pantry envelope stayed taped in its place, the way the house seemed to lean into its own frame as if bracing for weather. Frank died on a Tuesday just before dusk, the window cracked to let in the last warm air, the radio low on an oldies station. His hand was cool and heavy in mine, calluses like tiny maps under my thumb. He looked at the ceiling, not afraid, as if reading instructions I couldn't see. "Easy now," he whispered, the same words he used when we lowered a heavy board into place. His chest rose once, and then the room stopped keeping time. The oxygen machine kept purring a few seconds, as if it hadn't heard. I pressed my forehead to his knuckles and said, "I'm here." After that came a stillness I had never known, a stillness that felt like the world had stepped outside and closed the door. The hospice nurse arrived in a soft gray sweater, spoke gently, and did the quiet work of ending a chapter, calling the number on the fridge, noting the time, asking me if I wanted to keep his wedding band for now. I slid the chain from his neck and felt the faint warmth it had borrowed from his skin. I washed his coffee cup and set it upside down on the counter like any other night because my hands needed a job. The house smelled like buttermilk and antiseptic. Grief made even clean air seem used. I called my mother last. "He's gone," I said. There was a pause long enough to hear her change expressions. "I'll handle the arrangements," she answered, brisk already. "We should make it meaningful. The business community will want to pay respects." I said nothing. She took silence as consent and began listing venues, clergy she knew, a catering company with excellent press. When I hung up, I folded the blanket at the foot of the bed, smoothed the crease, and sat on the floor with my back against the frame because the bed itself felt like a lie. The funeral was 3 days later. Sun like a spotlight, heat pressing on the black fabric of my dress. The church smelled of lilies and furniture polish. Men in suits shook hands over my shoulder. I took a seat in the front pew and kept my eyes on the wood grain of the coffin, the way the light caught the knots. People whispered their favorite Frank stories, how he'd deliver a load himself when a driver called in sick, how he never charged for the last box of nails. I clung to those sentences like railings. Then my mother stepped to the lectern, perfect in navy, hair arranged to look effortless. She set her notes on the wood as if beginning a quarterly report. My father's legacy, she began, and I knew from the first crisp syllable that we were about to bury a balance sheet. She spoke of growth, of market share, of a brand he had positioned with integrity. She thanked our partners, praised our footprint, referenced a magazine profile from 10 years ago. She did not say his hands were always warm. She did not say he kept butterscotch candies for fussy kids at the register. She did not say his laugh came out like a cough when he tried to hide it. He leaves behind a business legacy that will endure, she concluded, voice bright, as if unveiling a new product. I stared at the floor until the pattern blurred. At the luncheon, she floated from table to table with the donor smile, linking arms with men who called Frank a hell of an operator. I poured coffee for a line of people who had known him by name, who remembered the way he'd tapped the counter twice before giving change. A cashier cried into a napkin and pressed a photo into my hand, Frank in a paper crown at a store holiday party, cheeks ruddy, eyes lit. I slipped it into my pocket like a relic. The day after the service, Mr. Collins invited us to his office for the reading. The brick building looked the same as always, but my feet felt heavy on the steps. The conference room was cold enough that I wished for a sweater. On the table sat a neat stack of folders, a glass pitcher beaded with condensation, and a plate of butter cookies no one touched. My mother placed her handbag beside a legal pad, poised like a student ready for a test she expected to ace. I sat opposite her, spine straight, hands in my lap, the chain with Frank's ring wrapped twice around my fingers. Collins's voice was even, respectful. He explained the format, the witnesses, the date. Then he began to read. The words blurred into the formal cadence of a language built to keep feelings out, bequeath, devise, execute residue. I heard my name in a preamble and waited for the next sentence to catch me. It didn't. To my daughter Carol, Collins read slowly, carefully, as if he knew where the breath would leave me. I leave all real property, including the primary residence, all controlling interest in Ramirez Building Supply, and the remainder of my estate, estimated at $36 million. He paused. Paper whispered as he turned the page. Certain conditions and instructions. The rest was sound without meaning. The room tilted. I stared at the condensation sliding down the pitcher and thought absurdly about how Frank always wiped glasses dry before setting them down. My mother did not gasp. She did not pretend surprise. She lifted her pen like a conductor and asked, "Can we get copies today?" Her voice carried a ribbon of triumph she tried to starch flat. Collins nodded. He glanced at me quick, steady, unreadable. My ears roared. My throat felt chalky. Afterward, in the hallway, my mother touched my elbow as if she owned that too. "We'll work something out," she said brightly. "There's plenty to go around." Her smile was the kind she used with photographers. I pulled my arm away, and the smile hardened 1 degree. "Don't be dramatic, Madison. This is how families build for the future." I couldn't find a place to put my eyes that didn't sting. Outside, the heat slapped my face, and for a second Dallas felt like a stage set. Brick, sky, a truck rumbling past with a ladder rattling in the bed. I braced my palms on the hood of my car and took 3 slow breaths the way Frank had taught me. Cheated. Abandoned. The words arrived like small stones in my mouth. I swallowed them because there was no one to hand them to. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, the ring on the chain knocked against the steering wheel. I held it tight until the metal warmed, as if heat could make anything hold. That same evening, Cruelty arrived in designer heels. We hadn't even made it home from Collins's office before my mother's tone turned metallic, like a door bolt. As soon as we crossed the threshold, she set her handbag on the entry table as if planting a flag and said, flat and practiced, "Pack your things. This house is mine now. I don't need a burden. You're useless." I stood there with my keys dangling from my finger, still wearing the dress I'd chosen for the funeral, the chain with Frank's ring pressing into my collarbone. I waited for her to add something human. "I'm grieving, I need space," but she only tapped her nails against the table, a slow metronome counting down my time. "But Mom," I said, my voice coming out thinner than I wanted. "I took care of him here. My things are." "This is not a discussion," she cut in, eyes on her phone. You have 2 hours. 2 hours. As if my life could be folded into that. I walked down the hallway like a guest in a museum where I'd once lived. The house already looked different, brighter in places I had kept dim for Frank's naps. The casserole dishes neighbors had sent were stacked neatly, labels peeled off as if generosity were clutter. I opened my bedroom door and stared at the bed I hadn't had time to make that morning, the sweater thrown over the chair, my notebook with the medication log still open to the last dose. I wanted to cling to the ordinary, round up laundry, wash cups, refill the pill organizer, and understood with a jolt there would be no more pills to sort. I packed the way you pack after a fire, badly. Jeans, 2 t-shirts, the photo of Frank in the paper crown, my toothbrush, socks that didn't match. In the kitchen, I took the note he'd taped inside the pantry, "Call these people before you worry," and slid it into my bag like a life raft. When the doorbell rang, it wasn't a neighbor with sympathy. 2 men in black polos stood on the stoop under the porch light, a corporate kind of bouncer calm in their faces. Security in white letters across their chests looked obscene in our doorway. My mother appeared behind them with a relieved brightness. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We're just keeping things orderly." One of the men nodded at me with a professional, almost kind expression, the kind of face you use when you've seen this before. "Ma'am, we're here to ensure a peaceful transition. Do you need help carrying your bags?" I swallowed something jagged. "No," I said. My voice shook, then steadied. "I've got it." They followed me room to room, not touching anything, simply standing like parentheses around my movements. In Frank's bedroom, the bed was stripped, a laundry basket already waiting as if the house had decided to erase itself. I picked up the chain with his wedding band and looped it back around my neck, letting the metal find the warm spot it knew. When I made the last trip to the door, my mother stepped aside without meeting my eyes. "Return the keys," she said. I dropped them into her palm. They sounded louder than they should have, a tiny metal confession that I no longer belonged. Outside, the evening had that bright Dallas hum, cicadas, distant traffic, a plane stitching white across the sky. I loaded my suitcase into my car by feel. The security guard held the door for me. "Take care, ma'am," he said quietly, and I nodded, grateful and humiliated that a stranger offered more kindness in 10 syllables than my mother had all day. I drove until the city loosened, past billboards for storage units and payday loans, past tire shops with flags that didn't quite match their poles. The motel I chose had a buzzing neon vacancy sign and a front desk behind plexiglass with a slot for IDs. The clerk slid me a key card and a receipt. "Breakfast 7 to 9, he added, pointing at a sign with a picture of a waffle shaped like Texas. "Ice machines broken." Room 216 looked like every room. Pattern bedspread you couldn't describe if your life depended on it, air conditioner rattling like cutlery in a drawer, a painting of a bowl of fruit that had never existed. I locked the door and set my bag on the carpet, and only then, with no one to see, did I let it happen. I cried into the towel I'd used to wrap the mug, into the sleeve of Frank's old shirt I'd stolen months ago to sleep in when he was in the hospital. The sound felt embarrassing even to myself, a hiccuping, ugly thing, but there was no one to apologize to, so I didn't. Sometime after midnight, I washed my face with a tiny bar of soap that smelled like over-bleached sheets. I sat on the edge of the bed and typed a text to my mother, "I hope you sleep well in your new house," and deleted it. I put the phone face down so it wouldn't glow at me like an accusation. Morning arrived mean and gray. I showered under a spray that felt like a garden hose and dressed in yesterday's jeans. The mirror over the sink had a scratch through the middle that lined up with the middle of my face. I made coffee in the lobby that tasted like burnt bread and carried it back to the room in a paper cup that said, "Have a nice day." I didn't. I opened my notebook and wrote the facts of the previous 24 hours in block letters like a police report, as if precision might leach out the hurt. At 8:17 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number, Dallas area code. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, my chest tight with a strange, suspended fear. Then I answered. "Hello." "Madison," a calm, familiar voice said. "It's Mr. Collins." The voice in my ear was calm and careful, like a hand on a railing. "Madison, your mother didn't read the terms of the will." I sat on the motel bed with a paper cup of burnt coffee going cold, eyes on the patterned bedspread. I couldn't describe if my life depended on it. What? Your grandfather foresaw everything, Mr. Collins said. I could hear paper shifting on his desk, the soft scrape of a folder opening. Her inheritance of $36 million is indeed hers, but on one condition: she must provide you with permanent housing and pay you monthly maintenance. If she violates these conditions, the entire inheritance will go to you. I closed my eyes. The sentence unpeeled itself in my head like tape. But she kicked me out yesterday. Collins didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Then I'm afraid Carol has just deprived herself of everything. Silence filled the room all at once. I looked at the motel curtains glowing orange from the parking lot lights, at my suitcase with the towel-wrapped Elvis mug peeking out. For 3 heartbeats, I said nothing. Then my chest found air again, and I heard myself whisper, "Are you sure?" "I drafted the clause with your grandfather," he said. He insisted on clarity. I advised him against surprises. He insisted on protections. This is not a trick. It is a condition precedent. She had a duty to house you and provide maintenance. Her actions yesterday constitute a breach. He paused, as if leaving space for the sound of a life turning. "I'd like you to meet me at my office at 10. We will do this by the book." By the book. I put on clean jeans, slid Frank's ring back under my shirt, and felt the metal warm against my skin. In the lobby, the clerk nodded at me like he'd seen every version of bad news before. I drove with both hands at 10 and 2, Frank's way, and repeated the clause to myself like a line from a song I needed to learn by heart. At Collins's office, the air was the same, cool, faintly of leather and copier toner. He met me at the door with a folder already labeled in his blocky hand. "Madison, transition." "Sit," he said gently. "We'll move step by step." He laid out a plan the way Frank used to lay out tools on a workbench, orderly, practical, nothing extraneous. First, a written notice to Carol of breach. Second, a petition to the probate court to confirm the triggering of the condition. Third, immediate protective measures for you and the property. "We will also inform the board of the company," he added. "And the bank." I folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. "What do I do?" "Just sign where I place the tabs." He slid a stack of papers toward me with blue flags like small sails. He explained each page, no jargon without translation. At the end, he looked up and said, "We'll also request a police presence when we serve her notice at the house. Your safety is paramount." A day later, we pulled into the driveway behind a squad car. The pecan tree cast a wide shade over the lawn. Someone had moved the porch chairs an inch to the left, just enough for me to notice and resent it. 2 officers waited near the walkway, hands easy at their sides, the way people stand when they expect adults to behave and are prepared for when they don't. My lawyer, Collins's associate, Ms. Patel, clipped and steady, checked her watch and then her folder. My mother opened the door before we knocked, as if she had been watching. Her face was a perfect mask until she saw the uniforms. Then something in her jaw tightened. "This is unnecessary," she said, voice cool. "I've already spoken to." Ms. Patel raised a hand. "Mrs. Ramirez, we're here to serve official notice." She unfolded a document and read in a clear voice that made each syllable land. "According to the unfulfilled terms of the will, Madison now owns the business, $36 million, and your house." The sentence fell into the foyer and lay there between us. Mom turned pale. For the first time in my life, I saw her hands tremble. It was small, a shiver at the tips of her fingers, the slightest shake as she reached for the paper, but it was real, and I will not pretend it didn't flood me with something hot and shameful and human. "Wait, this is absurd," she said, but the word didn't have its usual bite. "Frank would never." "He did," Ms. Patel said, not unkindly. "He foresaw this. We have filed with the court. Officers are present for safety. We ask that you refrain from interference." The officer stepped back to give her space to read. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched the moment she found the clause, watched denial roll into calculation, and then into a thin, fragile calm. She lifted her chin. "I'm calling my attorney," she announced, and swept into the kitchen, phone already to her ear. We waited on the porch. The wood felt solid under my feet, the way Frank's voice used to feel when he said my name. Ms. Patel reviewed the timeline again, practical as a shopping list. The bank would be notified. The company's board would convene for an emergency session. Locks on certain access points would be changed. Utilities kept running. "You are not evicting her today," she reminded me. "It is a legal transition. Stay in the lane." When Carol reappeared, the tremor in her hands had eased, replaced by a brittle brightness. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said to the officers. "We're a family." "We are," I said quietly. "And yesterday you hired strangers to escort me out." Her eyes flashed, wounded pride mixing with fury. "Madison, be reasonable." I was overwhelmed. I said things I didn't mean. Ms. Patel kept her voice gentle and strict at once. "Mrs. Ramirez, you may remain here for now until arrangements are finalized. But as of this notice, Madison is the owner of the residence and the controlling interest in Ramirez Building Supply, as well as the residuary estate per the condition clause. We will coordinate a respectful transition." The next 72 hours moved like an assembly line. Collins walked me through bank forms where signatures matter more than history. The board meeting was sober and brief. The manager with 22 years looked at me with wet eyes and said he would be proud, and that almost broke me. We changed passwords. We met with the accountant Frank trusted. I sat in Frank's office, touching nothing for a long minute, then moved the pencil cup half an inch back to where I knew he liked it. My mother tried a dozen strategies in as many hours. She pleaded with me privately in the hallway, hands pressed together like a prayer she hadn't learned the words to. "Madison, I was wrong. Give me at least part of the inheritance. I'm your mother." She alternated between softness and sharpness. "You don't understand the responsibility. Let me handle it. People know me. I can protect you from making mistakes." When I didn't answer fast enough, she pressed harder. "Do you want me living under a bridge? Is that what you want for your mother?" "No," I said, and I meant it. "I don't want that. So be sensible." I thought of Frank's lists, his jars, his careful block letters. I thought of how he'd told me not to confuse a stage with a home. "Being sensible," I said, "is honoring the plan he made." She stared at me like I'd switched languages. Then her shoulders dropped, and she tried another door. "I miss him, too," she whispered, and for a second I saw the girl who had been his daughter before the trophies, before the logos. The urge to forgive, to fix, to be the child who makes everything smooth rose in me like a tide. I took a breath. "I know," I said, "but we can't spend grief like cash." In the end, I didn't throw her out on the street. I asked Collins to set up a small trust with strict terms, housing paid for in a modest apartment of her choosing, a monthly stipend enough to live without worry, but not enough to build a new kingdom on. No control, no lump sum, no power to sell what wasn't hers. She could live separately from me and not be in need. The day we signed, she held the pen like it weighed a pound. "This is insulting," she muttered, and then, quieter, "This is something." The first night I slept in the house again, I sat at the kitchen table with the radio on low. The room felt exactly the same and entirely different. I didn't feel victorious. I washed the skillet, dried it slowly, and slid it into the oven to keep it from rusting. Then I taped the note he'd written, "Call these people before you worry," back inside the pantry door, exactly where it had been, and closed it gently. For years, I lived in the shadow of my mother's disdain, believing that if I studied harder, worked longer, or tried to please her just a little more, maybe she would finally see my value. But in the end, it took my grandfather's wisdom, his love, and his foresight to remind me that dignity cannot be bought or stolen. When the lawyers declared me the rightful heir, I saw my mother tremble for the first time in my life. That trembling wasn't just fear of losing money. It was fear of losing control. She had spent decades trying to reduce me to nothing, and suddenly the very will she had counted on to crown her queen of fortune stripped her of all power. I didn't leave her to starve, but I didn't give her back the empire she wanted either. She received just enough to live comfortably, nothing more, nothing less. Wealth, inheritance, or approval, they don't define your worth. Your worth is in your courage, your resilience, and your refusal to be silenced, no matter who tries to crush you, even if it's your own mother. And now, I want to ask you directly, would you forgive a mother who kicked you out for millions? Or would you leave her with nothing? Write your answer in the comments below. I want to hear your own story. And if you've ever been betrayed by family, hit that like button and subscribe, because more than anything, I want this channel to be a space where people like us can finally speak up and never again let anyone decide our value for us.